One of his biographers wrote, "He radiated confidence, impatience, faith that everything was proceeding satisfactorily. Just call me Ninoy," he said, and he swept me into his confidence in one breath.
Whomever he was with, talking to, I mean, he would make that person feel like that person was the most important person in the room.
When I first met him, he was rich, he was powerful, but he was a good man who was going to do and wanted to do good things for the people.
It's a peaceful revolution, I think. That is what he was looking for, because there's no victory in war.
I mean, as I say, when he was 17 years old, he went to become a war correspondent during the Korean War. And then when he came back, he ran for office, youngest mayor ever elected in the Philippines, youngest senator ever elected, youngest governor ever elected in the Philippines, and destined to be the youngest president, which is why Marcos declared martial law.
On September 23, midnight, Mr. Marcos went on television and said, "I, Ferdinand Marcos, acting as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the Philippines, I now declare martial law and shall administer this country alone." On that day, democracy died.
The first to be arrested was Ninoy Aquino, of course, while he was having a Senate hearing at Manila Hilton, I think.
Over a month, I think, that we were not allowed to see him. An army truck delivered all of his stuff, clothes, everything, including and up to a toothbrush. And my mother said, "Why are you returning his toothbrush?" And the female soldier said, "He has no more need of it."
For 7 years, I was not allowed to see the moon and the stars. I would walk and walk and walk across my room, just a room of about 4 meters by 5 meters, hoping that I'll get tired. And then when I get tired, I will fall asleep, knowing that tomorrow will be the same. I felt that I already earned my peace. I have done my best. I waited for 7 years and 7 months, and the Filipino people did not react. And they would even give me the impression that they love their chain and their slavery. What can one man do if the Filipino people love their slavery? If the Filipino people have lost their voice and would not say no to a tyrant, what can one man do? I have no army, I have no following, I have no money, I only have my indomitable spirit.
The writer Nick Joaquin organized Aquino's family history around 3 generations of people who defied authority. Ninoy's grandfather, Severiano Aquino, fought the colonial powers Spain and then its successor, the United States of America. He was a general and a rebel who became a national hero and, for a time, a political prisoner. His son, the senior Benigno Aquino, was also an ardent nationalist. When other politicians clung to the idea of a second-class affiliation with the United States, he campaigned vigorously for complete independence. When Japan captured the Philippines in late 1941, Benigno Sr., under pressure to soften the blow of invasion, was taken in by Japan's promise for an Asia for Asians. As the fortunes of Japan's military suffered, so did Benigno Aquino's reputation. He was imprisoned by the victorious Americans, then paroled to await trial on charges of collaborating with the enemy. In the company of his namesake, Benigno Jr., he suffered a heart attack. Ninoy told Nick Joaquin, "When the Americans came back, Papa was all of a sudden a collaborator. Those who I thought were my friends began to shun me. When he died, I thought my world had ended. Determined to recoup the family name, he started to work on the Manila Times at 15 as a copy boy. He ate, slept, and showered at the newspaper, and at odd hours he became a copywriter.
I think he started as a messenger boy, and they asked for volunteers of reporters to go to Korea, and nobody volunteered, so he volunteered. He was 17 years old.
He took his own photographs and became known in the press corps as Aquino, the milk boy. He said Korea aged him 10 or 20 years. It gave me the fatalism that's with me to this day. Do your job and hope tomorrow will be another day. And if tomorrow doesn't come, that's it. Returning home, the young journalist struck out into the mountains to interview the most renowned peasant rebel of Luzon, Luis Taruk. Through a series of meetings, Aquino became the conduit for Taruk's surrender, a national event that made Aquino a national figure. He described Taruk as one of the few men who impressed him in youth. He talked of the poor in this country. He opened my eyes to the inequities of my own hometown. I thought to myself, this is the first Christian I've met. The president, Ramon Magsaysay, gave Aquino a medal and enlisted him as an advisor, aide, and confidant.
I suppose his objective at that time was try to build a name for himself. He's the junior, which meant that my father had faith in him.
The same year, aged 21, he courted and married Corazon Cojuangco, a deeply religious, American-educated offspring of the largest landowners in Tarlac province. Aquino bought land and quickly made a success of farming. At President Magsaysay's urging, he ran for mayor of his hometown, Concepcion.
Knew exactly the pulse of the audience, when to crack a joke, when to touch their heart. When you draw an applause, people just go to hear him.
He can talk for not hours, for days, if given the chance.
And they always talked about Ninoy. They loved him and they were so impressed with. I said, what kind of family is this? This guy must be something.
He was, in his words, a radical rich guy. First as a mayor, then vice governor and governor of his province, he promoted land reform, equal access to public education, and social welfare. Almost daily, he drove or flew the 100 miles to Manila to serve President Magsaysay and then his successors. Three presidents in a row predicted that Aquino was destined to be president. The fourth took a less kindly view.
Marcos hated him, as people used to say, because he saw himself in Ninoy.
Marcos undercut Aquino's progressive social programs in Tarlac and accused Aquino of being a communist or in league with the communists. After 4 repressive years of the Marcos presidency, in 1967, Aquino ran nationwide for a seat in the Senate of the Philippines. And he won. and an adoring press called him Superboy.
Every one of us knew him because he had a long background in journalism. We knew he was bright. We knew he belonged to the right family. We know he talked fast, sharp, and being journalist, you said, we have to watch this guy.
On the floor of the Senate, Ninoy charged that Marcos was transforming democratic society into a garrison state. He famously predicted that Marcos was planning to impose martial law to extend himself in power beyond the constitutional limit of 8 years. The United States, with enormous influence over its one-time colony in the person of President Richard M. Nixon, closed its eyes. On September 13, 1972, Aquino exposed Marcos' plan for martial law on the Senate floor. 9 days later, democracy in the Philippines was extinguished. Aquino cheerfully organized his cellmates, but one by one they were let out or moved to new cells. Aquino was left to the one thing he seemed to fear: being alone. Aquino wrote newspaper accounts attacking martial law that were smuggled out and published internationally, the first public resistance to Philippine martial law. He was thrown into solitary confinement.
The greatest punishment that was given to him was not being in jail, but because they took him away from people. He just loved people. He glows when he talks to anybody, to you or to me or to the guards. And so what happened when they put him in isolation and they would not allow visitors? I think that was when it really hit him home.
When I saw him in Fort Magsaysay, he had to hold on to his pants, no? Because they literally were falling off him.
And with the light bulb, naked light bulb shining the whole night, 24 hours. He didn't know what time it was. He didn't know if it's day or night. And he was there for days in that situation, no reading. He had tremendous migraines because they took away his glasses. And so he had nothing but prayer.
Within the timeless cave of Ninoy's cell, Jesus became a live human being. He berated Aquino for his self-pity. He told Aquino that with political success, he had become more and more like Marcos. He stood me face to face with myself and forced me to look at my emptiness and nothingness. And there, I found my inner peace.
And that Fort Magsaysay, I think, was the turning point. From an ambitious politician to somebody committed to doing God's work for the people. No?
His goal was no longer power in and of itself, but awakening his countrymen.
I have read Mahatma Gandhi in prison. And this frail man, this man of almost 60 years old, barely 96 pounds, fought the entire British Empire and caused that empire to collapse. Why? Because he had an indomitable spirit. And as long as man will refuse to be defeated, you are never defeated.
Aquino undertook a hunger strike that nearly ended his life. His lawyers came often to defend him in a military tribunal. But in the end, Aquino dismissed the proceeding as a farce, a kangaroo court, and refused to participate. He was sentenced to die before a firing squad. He remained defiant. Protest is part and parcel of the democratic evolution of man. To protest is not only a right, it is a duty. To those who visited, he remained cheerful, confident, and determined.
Never did he show that his spirit was low. That was remarkable. At all times, he showed the vibrancy of we would say, of a leader.
The American Pat Darien had fought for civil rights in Mississippi, and now she was the point person for human rights of the new American president, Jimmy Carter. Visiting Manila, she pressed Marcos to return to democracy.
I said, I don't understand how things work here. And could you just explain how it is that you have such bad human rights policies? And he said, well, it's really out of his hands, he said, pointing around the table. I said, are these all government officials? He said, well, no, they are Imelda's people. They are in charge of everything. They tell Imelda what they want. And Imelda tells them what she wants. And I said, well, you're the president. Why don't you do that? He said, they'll kill me.
She demanded to see Aquino, and late one night, she was abruptly taken from a dinner party to Fort Bonifacio prison.
I said, I don't want this visit to cause you any pain. I don't want you to be punished in some way for this discussion that you didn't even know about. And he said, I will say anything I wish to say. There's nothing left that they can do. And a lot of times when you talk to someone in prison like that, they'll tell you how they think you ought to go about getting them out. He never did that. He was a brilliant, brilliant fellow. And he told about how the people were suffering, how the Marcoses were stealing money. Everybody was expected to pay homage to them. He thought that Imelda was the one that really did the trick. Felt that he was too dangerous, that he was a rival.
Marcos, in an attempt to legitimize his rule, decided in 1978 to hold one of his rigged elections. Aquino's colleagues advised boycotting, but Aquino believed in displaying resistance to the dictatorship wherever possible. He decided to run for Congress from prison and to organize a slate of candidates.
Lakas ng Bayan, power of the people. That name Ninoy gave to the party that was challenging Marcos in the Metro Manila area, Lakas ng Bayan.
Cory and his youngest daughter, Chris, spoke for him at rallies.
And Chris, I think, who was 6 years old or barely 7, started rattling off all the names of the 21. And the crowd will roar with her memory of the 21 names.
The symbol of resistance, the sign of the L, came into widespread use.
It represents the word laban, which in English means fight. When you do something like this, that means you're ready to fight for what you believe in.
Aquino asked his followers to make a little noise the night before the election, April the 6th.
Ninoy had expressed the desire to please let me at least hear that the people are not sleeping in these times of darkness, but that some of them are awake, just a few of them, for just a few minutes to shout their rejection of the regime. Jerry Esguerra was so sure that the majority of the people, if you tell them as a form of protest to make a noise, they will make a noise. And they did. They did not for a few minutes, but for hours upon hours on end until almost the next morning. So it was the Ninoy desired lakas ng bayan, power of the people.
The noise barrage laid bare the stuffing of the ballot box. When the dictatorship announced that Aquino had been defeated, election fraud was there for all to see.
The first incident that solidified the opposition was that Laban campaign of 1978. When we lost, then that incident that could have been a catalyst also fizzled out.
Days, weeks, months, 2 more years passed. Marcos was afraid of executing Aquino, but also feared letting him loose. Aquino suffered a heart attack. When he refused to be treated by Marcos's doctors, he was hurriedly removed from prison and put on a flight to the United States.
It was 1980. When Ninoy came here, Marcos let him leave the country for an emergency heart bypass operation. And they're all very happy. Ninoy's out of prison. They're a family again. The kids are going to school. He taught some classes and he did research. And his research was basically trying to restore democracies in countries around the world through peaceful means.
During Aquino's nearly 8 years in prison, opposition to Marcos had formed within the Philippines and among exiles in the United States. A prominent liberal, Raul Manglapos, had been traveling in the U.S. when martial law was declared. He stayed put and became a figure in the movement for a free Philippines. Charles Avila was one of the many young people guided by Pope John XXIII's teachings to take the problems of the poor as your own.
Left of center or centrist position that was anti-fascist, anti-dictatorship, but non-communist.
Kapulungan ng mga sandigan ng Pilipinas. It means Confederation of Pillars of the Philippines. It was one of the wings of the social democratic movement. And we would like have masses, and the priest would say in communion, come and receive the body and blood of Christ if you are ready to give your life to your country.
What I call myself is a hardcore nationalist, and at that time I did, and I was willing to do anything to get Marcos out of there. Someone had come to my residence, someone I had known from my activist years in the 70s, early 70s, and he asked me to, if I could plant a bomb at the convention where Marcos was speaking, and I was very hesitant at first, but I told them to give me a day to think it over seriously, and after a day, I weighed, I processed everything, and I said, okay, I said, I'll do it. So meeting places and all that were arranged. And my condition for doing it was, I didn't want anyone killed. I just said, just make it a small bomb. Because I knew that the purpose was it was a gem of an opportunity for propaganda, and we did want to bring the dictatorship to its knees, and I did realize too that this was a prime occasion for getting world attention to what Marcos was doing here. So I did it.
A Greek-American businessman, Steve Xenakis, and his aristocratic Filipino wife, Presi Lopez Xenakis, settled in San Francisco. Marcos had taken Presi's brother hostage and then systematically plundered the Lopez family assets.
And the decision to devote all my time to try to help the people of the Philippines to get him out, I felt that you have to fight for what's right, not for what are the percentages of success. It's easy to decide on what you do every day. You don't say first, let me see if this will affect my family or will hurt my children or will take my property. You do it because you have to do it. And then the odds change because you don't calculate the odds.
Sonny Alvarez had opposed Marcos' attempts to change the Philippine Constitution. Alvarez had gone underground in Manila the day martial law was declared.
So I jumped out of bed and started to look for refuge. I'd worked around in disguise and I moved around. And sometimes I find myself in one community, deliver a fast speech, then go. And then one time, President Macapagal, who had become the president of the Constitutional Convention, he said that there's need to have an organized opposition overseas. So he turned to me and said, about you, Sonny. He called me Sonny. You're a bachelor, you're young. So I said, yes, why not? I would.
Throughout the exile period, Filipinos within the U.S. were spied upon, threatened, and sometimes terrorized.
Marcos was a very, very brilliant man. He knew he could not follow 1,000 people all over the United States to see what they're doing, but he would do selectively. He would do something which would be deliberately disclosed, so everybody would be terrified. Everybody thought that Marcos had 3 agents following every person here, that he knew everything you do. So everybody was terrified that he couldn't do anything because Marcos would know about it.
I read in the papers that my brother was killed. I was warned first. I was warned. They gouged his eyes. They bashed his head. They cut his tongue and broke his teeth. He was so mangled. It was really, I think, deliberately intended to drive home a message that if you oppose the regime, there could be these terrible consequences. They call the system selective terror.
When Ninoy Aquino arrived in the U.S. in 1980, the opposition to Marcos became more unified, vocal, and active.
In the name of the members of the Movement for a Free Philippines and all other freedom fighters, I salute you and welcome you.
The most important division within the anti-Marcos movement was between the philosophies of violence and non-violence. The exiled Aquino was in communication with all anti-Marcos groups, but consistently came down on the side of non-violence.
And this idea of soul force, of the power of the truth, of the power to say no, and the power to contaminate soul to soul, people with your courage, with your passion, because you love, because you tell the truth, because you are ready to lay down your life. Ninoy was so. I said, this is a different game. This is not a politician. This was Ninoy now saying, remember, it is massive non-violence. It's the power of the people. The people are non-violent.
People whose name I cannot now tell you because their lives are in danger. They told me, Mr. Senator, they said, we have waited 8 years for you. Lead us. We are now ready. Maybe we are a handful, but we are now ready to lay down our lives, and these are young Filipino boys and girls. I told them, if you go into the road of violence, it will only lead to more violence, I said. And what will happen when 10,000 boys and girls are already dead in the streets of Manila and blood will be flowing in our very streets? I cannot, I said, resist the wailing of mothers who will now blame me that their children have died in the altar of freedom.
He had done everything he could in the United States and outside of the Philippines. He had rallied the opposition. He had spoken against Marcos. He had testified before Congress, and there was nothing more he could do. So he felt that he really had to go home.
I told Ninoy, I really honestly feel, Ninoy, that when you alight from the plane, you will be shot. And there was a moment of silence, and then Ninoy looks at me and he says, you know, June, I am happy for that God gave me the second life that I have now. It's just a bonus for me. So that even if I were placed in a box, I would still go home because the Filipinos are worth dying for.
I was against it. I mean, I told him, Ninoy, you suffered for 7 years and 7 months in prison, and I think you've suffered enough for your country. Why should you suffer more?
I wrote Mr. Marcos and I told him that while I have vowed never to enter the political arena again, I shall dedicate the last drop of my blood to the restoration of freedom and the dismantlement of your martial law. Do not forget that your readiness to suffer will light the torch of freedom which can never be put out. And learn to say no. No to tyranny, no to corruption, no to all this degradation of human dignity. The moment you say no, you're beginning to protest. The moment you say no to tyranny, you're beginning the struggle, the long, lonely road to freedom.